I found the photograph at a library book sale in Providence, Rhode Island. It was early September, one of those perfect New England days when summer hasn't quite let go, but autumn is already whispering through the leaves. The Providence Public Library was clearing out materials from their local history collection, duplicates, items that had been digitized, things they no longer had room to store. I'd been browsing the photography boxes for about an hour when I found it, tucked into a manila envelope labeled St. Catherine's Home for Children, miscellaneous. The photograph was mounted on heavy cardboard, about 8 by 10 inches, with a photographer's mark embossed in the corner. Harrington Studios, Providence, R.I. The image showed 11 children and 1 adult woman, all standing on what appeared to be a wooden platform or step in front of a clapboard building. The children ranged in age from perhaps 6 to 14, dressed in the simple, somewhat worn clothing typical of institutional life in the early 1900s. The woman, clearly the matron or superintendent, stood at the right edge of the photograph in a high-necked black dress, her expression stern and watchful. It was a typical institutional photograph, the kind taken annually to document the children in care, to show donors and board members that the orphanage was properly managing its wards. There was something melancholy about it, as there always is with orphanage photographs. These were children without families, without the security and love that should have been their birthright. But there was also something else. Something I couldn't quite identify at first. I studied each face carefully. Most of the children looked appropriately somber, the way children in institutions were expected to look, clean, orderly, respectful. But one child, a girl standing in the front row wearing a light-colored dress, had an expression that seemed different from the others. Her face was rounder, more mature somehow. Her eyes had a quality that the other children lacked. Not innocence exactly, but awareness. The kind of awareness that comes with years of experience. On the back of the mounting board, someone had written in faded ink, St. Catherine's Home for Children, Providence, Rhode Island, September 1907. Children and Miss Eleanor Winters, superintendent below that, in different handwriting, and apparently added years later, was a single line that made my breath catch. See State Investigation Report, April 1908. I bought the photograph for $2, along with several other items from the collection. That evening, I began researching St. Catherine's Home for Children. It had operated in Providence from 1892 to 1924, serving orphaned and abandoned children from across Rhode Island. It was a private institution, funded by charitable donations and small payments from the state for each child in its care. By most accounts, it had been a reasonably well-run facility for its time. Not luxurious, but not abusive either. The children received basic education, religious instruction, and training in practical skills that would help them find employment when they aged out of the system. But when I searched for information about a state investigation in 1908, I found something extraordinary. In the archives of the Rhode Island State Library, I located a report titled Investigation into Irregularities at St. Catherine's Home for Children, April 1908. The report was 50 pages long, typed on an old manual typewriter with handwritten annotations in the margins. I started reading, and within the first few pages, I understood why someone had written that note on the back of the photograph. Report of Investigation, State Board of Charities and Corrections, Commonwealth of Rhode Island, April 15th, 1908. Summary of findings. On March 3rd, 1908, this board received an anonymous letter alleging improprieties at St. Catherine's Home for Children in Providence. The letter claimed that the institution was accepting payment for children who were not, in fact, children, and that records were being falsified to defraud the state of Rhode Island. Initial inquiries by this board determined that St. Catherine's had been receiving state payments for an average of 15 children over the past 3 years. Records indicated that children entered and departed the institution at normal rates, with documentation appearing to be in order. However, upon closer examination prompted by the anonymous letter, investigators discovered significant irregularities. Specifically, it was determined that one individual listed as a child resident, name recorded as Sarah Mills, age 11, was in fact a 32-year-old woman named Sarah Brennan, who had been residing at St. Catherine's since October 1905. Mrs. Brennan had been passing as a child for approximately 2.5 years, during which time the state paid St. Broho B's Catherine's the standard per-child monthly stipend of 8.0 sous for her care and maintenance. Total fraudulent payments amounted to approximately 240 $. I stopped reading and flipped back to the photograph. A 32-year-old woman passing as an 11-year-old child for 2.5 years. Which one was she? I studied the faces again. The girl in the light-colored dress in the front row, the one whose face had seemed more mature, whose eyes had that quality of adult awareness. That had to be Sarah Brennan. I returned to the report. Investigation details. On March 10th, 1908, investigators from this board arrived unannounced at St. Catherine's Home. Miss Eleanor Winters, superintendent, was visibly distressed by the surprise inspection, but cooperated fully once the nature of our inquiry was explained. When asked about Sarah Mills, Miss Winters initially provided the standard file: admission date, previous placement, health records, education progress. All appeared routine. However, when investigators requested to interview Sarah Mills directly, Miss Winters became agitated. She claimed the child was ill and confined to bed. Investigators insisted, and Miss Winters reluctantly led them to the dormitory. The individual in the bed was clearly not a child. Though small in stature, approximately 4'9" tall, and slight in build, she was obviously an adult woman. When questioned, she initially maintained that she was 11 years old. But under continued questioning, she broke down and admitted the truth. Her real name was Sarah Brennan. She was 32 years old. She had been living at St. Catherine's, pretending to be a child, since October 1905. The report went on for pages, detailing the interviews with Sarah, with Miss Winters, with the other children at St. Catherine's, and with various board members and donors. What emerged was a story far more complex than simple fraud. Testimony of Sarah Brennan, excerpt. I never meant any harm. I know what I did was wrong, but I was desperate. My husband died in 1904. We had no children, and his family wanted nothing to do with me. I tried to find work, but positions for women are scarce, and the ones available pay barely enough to survive. By the summer of 1905, I was destitute. I'd been evicted from my room. I was sleeping in parks and eating from charity kitchens. I knew I couldn't survive another winter on the streets. I've always been small. People often thought I was younger than my age. When I was 20, strangers assumed I was 12 or 13. It caused me great embarrassment then. But in 1905, desperate and starving, I realized my size might save my life. I cut my hair short, in the style young girls wear. I found clothing at a charity shop, a child's dress that fit me. I dirtied my face and went to St. Catherine's, claiming I was an orphan named Sarah Mills, 11 years old, whose parents had died of typhoid fever. Miss Winters examined me. I could tell she was suspicious. I'm small, but my face. You can see I'm not really a child if you look closely. But she didn't turn me away. She asked me questions about my supposed parents, about my life before. I had prepared a story, and I told it convincingly. Finally, she said, "I know you're not 11 years old. I'm not sure exactly how old you are, but you're certainly not a child." I thought I was caught. I started to leave, but she stopped me. "However," she said, "you're clearly in desperate circumstances, and you're small enough that you could pass for a child from a distance. If you're willing to live as one of the children here, to follow all the rules and behave appropriately, I can offer you a place. You'll have food, shelter, and safety. In exchange, I'll receive the state stipend for your care. It benefits us both." I was shocked. I asked why she would take such a risk. She told me that St. Catherine's was chronically underfunded. The donations they received barely covered operating costs. The state stipends for children in their care were essential to keeping the institution open. But finding children to fill the beds was increasingly difficult. Other institutions were better funded, had better reputations. St. Catherine's was struggling. By taking me in and registering me as a child, she could receive an additional stipend while also doing an act of charity, giving a desperate woman shelter and food. I agreed immediately. What choice did I have? It was either accept her offer or freeze to death that winter. So I became Sarah Mills, age 11. I lived in the dormitory with the real children. I attended the basic lessons Miss Winters provided. I did chores alongside the others. I ate the same meals, followed the same schedule, wore the same institutional clothing. It was strange at first. I was a grown woman, living as a child. I had to remember to act young, to speak as a child would, to play and move and react as if I were 11 years old. But I adapted, and after a while, it became almost natural. The children accepted me as one of them. They didn't question my age. I was small and thin enough to pass, especially since the younger children had nothing to compare me against. I lived this way for 2.5 years. I know it was a fraud. I know I was helping Miss Winters deceive the state. But I was also surviving. I had food every day. I had a bed in a heated building. I had safety. Is that wrong? I don't know anymore. I broke the law, but the law offered me no other options. As a destitute woman, I had no rights, no protections, no assistance. As a child, even a false one, I at least had shelter. I read Sarah's testimony 3 times, trying to process what I was learning. This wasn't a simple case of fraud. It was a survival story, a commentary on how few options existed for poor women in the early 1900s, and a strange act of mutual benefit between a desperate woman and a struggling institution. The report continued with testimony from Miss Eleanor Winters. Testimony of Miss Eleanor Winters, Superintendent, excerpt. "I make no excuses for what I did. I knew it was improper. I knew it violated the terms of our agreement with the state. But I also knew that both Sarah and St. Catherine's would benefit from the arrangement, and I could not see the harm in it. When Sarah first came to me, I knew immediately she was not a child. I've been working with children for 20 years. I can tell the difference between an 11-year-old and a grown woman, regardless of stature. but I also saw a human being in desperate need. Sarah was starving. She was homeless. She would not have survived the winter. What was I to do? Turn her away to die? I also saw an opportunity for St. Catherine's. We are not a wealthy institution. We struggle constantly with insufficient funding. The donations we receive are irregular and often inadequate. The state stipends are essential to our operation. We had empty beds. We had space for more children. But children are not as plentiful as they once were. Families are smaller, and other institutions are attracting the children who do need placement. By accepting Sarah and registering her as a child, I could receive an additional $8 per month from the state. That money helped feed all the children, heat the building, make repairs. It benefited everyone at St. Catherine's, not just Sarah. I understand that I broke the law. I understand that what I did was technically fraud against the state, but I would ask the board to consider the circumstances. I provided shelter to a desperate woman. I used the money I received to care for genuine orphans. No one was harmed by my actions. In fact, several lives were improved. Does the law exist to create rigid rules that must be followed even when they cause harm? Or does it exist to serve justice and human welfare? I chose the latter interpretation. I accept the consequences of that choice. The investigation report noted that Miss Winters was immediately dismissed from her position, and St. Catherine's was required to repay the fraudulent stipends. Criminal charges were considered but ultimately not pursued, largely because of public sympathy for both Sarah and Miss Winters. The case had apparently created something of a sensation in Providence. I found several newspaper articles from April and May 1908. From the Providence Journal, April 18th, 1908. The Curious Case of the Adult Orphan. Providence Society has been fascinated by the revelation that St. Catherine's Home for Children harbored an unusual resident, a 32-year-old woman living as an 11-year-old orphan for more than 2 years. Mrs. Sarah Brennan, widowed and destitute, assumed the identity of Sarah Mills in 1905 and took up residence at St. Catherine's with the knowledge and cooperation of the superintendent, Miss Eleanor Winters. The arrangement has sparked debate throughout the city. Some call it outrageous fraud that must be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Others see it as a creative solution to problems created by insufficient social welfare provisions. Mrs. Brennan testified that she faced starvation and homelessness, with no options for survival available to her as a poor widow. By assuming the identity of a child, she gained access to food, shelter, and safety that society otherwise denied her. Miss Winters, who has been dismissed from her position, argues that she was performing an act of charity while also benefiting the institution she served. The state payments for Mrs. Brennan's care helped fund the operation of St. Catherine's, benefiting the genuine orphans in residence. The case raises uncomfortable questions about the adequacy of our social provisions for destitute adults, particularly women. If a grown woman must pretend to be a child to receive basic necessities, what does that say about our society's values? I found more articles over the following weeks documenting the public debate. Some writers were outraged by the fraud and demanded prosecution. Others were sympathetic to Sarah's plight and critical of a system that offered children more protections than destitute adults. The most interesting article I found was from a women's suffrage newspaper, the Rhode Island Woman's Journal, dated May 2nd, 1908. The Sarah Brennan Case and Women's Rights. The scandal at St. Catherine's Home should shock us, but not for the reasons most commentators suggest. Yes, fraud was committed. Yes, the state was deceived. But the real scandal is that a grown woman had more options available to her as a pretend child than as an actual adult. Consider Mrs. Brennan's situation. Widowed, childless. Without family support, she faced homelessness and starvation. She sought work but found wages insufficient to survive. She sought charity but found resources inadequate. As an adult woman, she had no claim on society's protection. No one was obligated to house her, feed her, or ensure her survival. But as a child, even a pretend one, she immediately had access to shelter, food, education, and safety. The state of Rhode Island was willing to pay $8 per month for her care, a sum it would never have spent on her as a destitute adult woman. This is the fundamental inequality we must address. Children deserve protection and care, certainly. But so do adult women. So do all human beings who find themselves unable to survive without assistance. Mrs. Brennan should not have had to pretend to be a child to access basic human necessities. The fact that she did reveals a profound failure of our social systems. The solution is not to prosecute Mrs. Brennan or Miss Winters more harshly. The solution is to create systems that protect and support destitute adults with the same commitment we show to orphaned children. Until we do, we can expect more desperate people to find creative, if illegal, ways to survive. And we will have no moral standing to judge them harshly for it. I spent the next week researching what happened to Sarah Brennan after the scandal. I found her name in city directories, census records, and eventually an obituary. After leaving St. Catherine's in March 1908, Sarah had apparently struggled for several months. But the publicity around her case had created unexpected opportunities. A wealthy Providence widow, Mrs. Catherine Abbott, had been moved by Sarah's story and offered her a position as a companion and household assistant. Sarah worked for Mrs. Abbott for 15 years, until Mrs. Abbott's death in 1923. In her will, Mrs. Abbott left Sarah a modest bequest, enough to live on for the rest of her life, if she was frugal. Sarah lived quietly in Providence until her death in 1947, at age 71. Her obituary mentioned her years of service to Mrs. Abbott, but made no reference to the scandal that had briefly made her famous. I also researched Miss Eleanor Winters. After her dismissal from St. Catherine's, she had difficulty finding employment in institutional work. The scandal had tainted her reputation. But she eventually found a position as a private tutor for wealthy families, work she continued until her retirement in 1925. In her later years, according to an interview I found in a 1932 social work journal, Miss Winters remained unapologetic about her actions. I did what I thought was right at the time, and I still believe it was right. The rules said Sarah Brennan wasn't entitled to help because she was an adult, not a child. But common decency said she deserved help because she was a human being in need. I chose common decency over bureaucratic rules, and I would do so again. The photograph, taken in September 1907, 6 months before the scandal broke, captured Sarah Brennan in her role as Sarah Mills, child orphan. Looking at it now, knowing the truth, I could see details I'd missed initially. Sarah was positioned in the front row, slightly separated from the other children. Her posture was more upright, more controlled than the younger children around her. Her hands, visible at her sides, were an adult woman's hands, work-worn, the fingers longer and more developed than a child's would be. And her face, At first glance, she could pass for a young teenager. Her small stature and slight build supported the illusion. But her eyes told the truth. They had seen too much, experienced too much, to belong to an 11-year-old. Miss Winters stood at the edge of the photograph, her expression stern. But now I wondered if there was something else in her face. Wariness, perhaps, or the constant tension of maintaining a deception she knew was wrong, but felt was necessary. The other children in the photograph seemed genuinely young, genuinely orphaned. I wondered if any of them knew the truth about Sarah. The investigation report mentioned interviewing the children, and several had testified that they thought Sarah was strange or different, but assumed she was simply older than her listed age, perhaps 13 or 14 rather than 11. None of them had guessed she was 32. I decided to write an article about the case for a journal that specialized in the history of social welfare. I was particularly interested in what Sarah's story revealed about the gaps in early 20th century social support systems. As I researched further, I found that Sarah's case, while unusual in its specific details, reflected a broader pattern. Many women in the early 1900s faced similar situations, widowed or abandoned, without family support, unable to find adequate employment, facing homelessness and starvation. The social welfare systems of the time were primarily designed for children, for the deserving poor who were seen as innocent victims of circumstance. Adult women, especially those without children, were often viewed with suspicion. They were expected to have family support or to find husbands. If they failed to secure these traditional protections, they were sometimes blamed for their own destitution. Charitable institutions existed, but they were often inadequate, underfunded, or restricted to specific categories of need. A destitute widow without children might not qualify for aid from institutions designed for mothers and infants, or from those serving elderly women, or from those helping women escaping abusive situations. Sarah had fallen through every crack in the system, and so she'd done the only thing she could think of. She'd made herself into someone the system was designed to help. She'd become a child. The article I wrote was titled, "The Adult Orphan, Sarah Brennan and the Limits of Progressive-Era Social Welfare." It was published in the Journal of Social History and generated considerable interest among scholars of the period. I received emails from several researchers who'd encountered similar cases in their own work. Adults passing as children to access institutional care, or engaging in other forms of identity fraud to survive when legitimate options were unavailable. One historian sent me documentation of a case from Chicago in 1911, where a 50-year-old man had passed as a 14-year-old boy in an industrial school for 2 years before being discovered. Another found records of women claiming to be teenage girls to access reform schools that provided food and shelter, along with moral instruction. These cases revealed the same pattern: desperate people finding creative ways to access social support systems that excluded them, often with the cooperation or willful ignorance of institutional staff who understood the desperation and chose compassion over strict rule enforcement. The photograph of St. Catherine's Orphans now hangs in my study, properly preserved behind UV protective glass. I look at it often, drawn to Sarah Brennan's face, to the strange courage it must have taken to live as a child when you were 32 years old. I think about the daily reality of her deception. She would have had to moderate her voice, speak in simpler sentences, pretend ignorance of things an 11-year-old wouldn't know. She would have had to play children's games, sleep in a dormitory with actual children, submit to the authority of adults who were younger than she was. And she did it for 2.5 years. 2.5 years of pretending, of constant vigilance against discovery, of living a lie that was also her survival. Was it fraud? Yes, technically. The state was paying for her care under false pretenses. St. Catherine's was receiving money for a child who wasn't actually a child. But was it wrong? That's more complicated. Sarah wasn't stealing from anyone. The money the state paid was used to feed and house her, exactly as it would have been used for a real child. Miss Winters wasn't pocketing the funds or using them for personal enrichment. The institution was receiving its standard per-child stipend and providing standard care in return. The only fraud was in the category of person being helped, an adult instead of a child. But if the outcome was the same, a vulnerable person being fed and housed, did the category really matter? Or did it matter only because society had decided that children deserved help while adults did not? That orphans were deserving poor while widows were not? That youth entitled you to compassion while age meant you should have figured things out already? Sarah's case forced these questions into public view. And while she and Miss Winters faced consequences for their deception, the case also sparked reforms. I found records showing that in 1909, Rhode Island established a new program providing small stipends to destitute widows. It wasn't much, just enough to cover basic room and board, but it was something. The program explicitly cited the Sarah Brennan case as evidence of the need for better support systems for adult women without family resources. Similar programs were established in other states over the following years, part of the broader progressive-era reforms, aimed at addressing social problems through government intervention. Sarah Brennan, the adult orphan who'd committed fraud to survive, had inadvertently helped create systems that would prevent other women from needing to make the same choice. I think about that sometimes, looking at the photograph. Sarah stands among the children, her face carefully composed, maintaining her deception for the camera. She has no idea that in 6 months she'll be discovered. She has no idea that her story will spark public debate and eventual reform. She's just trying to survive another day. And Miss Winters stands at the edge, stern and watchful, protecting her charges, including the one who isn't really a child. She's broken the rules to do what she thought was right, and she'll pay a price for it. But she'll also help demonstrate that sometimes the rules themselves are the problem. The other children in the photograph are genuine orphans, victims of circumstance beyond their control. They had no choice about becoming wards of the state. But Sarah chose it, deliberately creating the circumstances that would make her eligible for help. Does that make her less deserving? Or does her desperation, her willingness to surrender her adult identity, to access basic necessities, make her need even more evident? These are the questions the photograph poses, across more than a century. And they're questions we still haven't fully answered. We've created better social welfare systems than existed in 1907, certainly. We have unemployment insurance, social security, food assistance programs, homeless shelters. We've acknowledged that society has some responsibility to help people in need, regardless of age. But gaps still exist. people still fall through cracks in the system, and people still find themselves choosing between legal rules and survival, between maintaining their identity and accessing help. Sarah Brennan's choice, to pretend to be a child, to live a lie, to commit fraud, was a choice made under duress. She didn't do it for profit or gain beyond the basic necessities of life. She did it because the alternatives were homelessness, starvation, and likely death. That's not really a choice at all. That's coercion by circumstance. The photograph captures a moment in September 1907, when 11 children and one adult woman stood on a wooden platform in Providence, Rhode Island, and held still for the camera. 10 of those children were genuinely young, genuinely orphaned, genuinely dependent on the charity of others. But one was a 32-year-old woman, maintaining an elaborate deception, risking discovery and prosecution, all for the privilege of sleeping in a dormitory, eating institutional food, and being treated like a child. The fact that this was her best option, her only option, is an indictment of the social systems of the time. The fact that she had to be discovered, exposed, and publicly examined before those systems began to change is an indictment of how social reform happens. Slowly, reactively, often only when the failures become too visible to ignore. Sarah Brennan was an adult orphan, a woman without family or resources or social standing, invisible to the systems designed to help people, until she made herself into someone they would recognize, a child. For 2.5 years, she succeeded. She became Sarah Mills, 11 years old, one more orphan among many. She survived. When the truth came out, she was briefly famous, briefly scandalous. Then she returned to obscurity, working quietly for a kind employer, living a modest life, and dying at 71 without fanfare. But her story remains, preserved in investigation reports and newspaper articles, and one formal photograph taken in September 1907. A story about the desperation of poverty, the rigidity of social systems, the compassion of one woman willing to break rules to help another, and the strange courage it takes to surrender your identity to survive. The photograph looks normal at first glance. Just another institutional portrait, another group of orphans documented for posterity. But look closer. Look at the girl in the light-colored dress in the front row. Look at her eyes, her posture, her hands. That's not a child. That's a woman who had no other choice. And that changes everything about how we read the image, about what it tells us about the past, and about what questions it poses for the present. May Sarah Brennan rest in peace. May her desperation serve as a reminder of why social systems must be designed with flexibility and compassion. And may her courage, the courage to live a lie to survive, be remembered as testimony to the failure of a society that made such choices necessary. The photograph remains, silent witness to a strange chapter in American social history. One adult woman among 10 children, all of them needing help, but only some of them officially eligible to receive it. Until one woman decided that the categories didn't matter as much as survival, that the rules could be broken if the alternative was death, and that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to disappear. She became a child to survive. And in doing so, she helped change the systems that had made such desperate measures necessary. That's the real story the photograph tells. Not just about one woman's deception, but about the social structures that made that deception her only option, and about the reforms that eventually made such desperate measures less necessary. The adult orphan, hiding in plain sight, captured forever in a photograph from September 1907. Her name was Sarah Brennan. She was 32 years old, and she deserved better than a world that only recognized her need when she pretended to be a child.